19th November, 1942. Dawn breaks over the frozen steppe, 150 kilometers northwest of Stalingrad. The fog is so thick that Romanian sentries cannot see beyond their own trench lines. They huddle in their positions, breath misting in the frigid air, rifles clutched with frozen fingers. The temperature has dropped to minus 15 degrees Celsius overnight. These men, farmers and factory workers conscripted from villages across Romania, have been holding this desolate stretch of the Don River for weeks, waiting for an enemy that never comes. Their German allies have assured them that the Soviets are broken, that the war is nearly won. But something feels wrong this morning. The silence is too complete, too perfect. Then, at 7:30 a.m., the earth erupts. 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces, the largest concentration of firepower ever assembled, open fire simultaneously. The barrage is apocalyptic. Shells scream overhead in an unending torrent, obliterating trenches, command posts, ammunition dumps. Romanian soldiers are buried alive as their positions collapse. Others are torn apart by shrapnel or incinerated by direct hits. The bombardment lasts 80 minutes. When it finally stops, the silence that follows is more terrifying than the noise. Because now, through the smoke and fog, comes a new sound, the grinding of tank treads. Hundreds of them. The Soviets are coming. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from? And could you have held your ground as an empire collapsed around you? To understand how the most powerful army in the world found itself trapped and dying in the ruins of a Russian city, we must go back 6 months to the scorching summer of 1942, when Adolf Hitler made a decision that would change the course of human history. By June 1942, Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, had been underway for exactly 1 year. The initial onslaught had been devastating. In 6 months, the Wehrmacht had advanced over 1,000 kilometers, captured millions of prisoners, and reached the outskirts of Moscow and Leningrad. But the knockout blow had never landed. The Soviet Union, battered and bleeding, refused to fall. The winter counteroffensive of 1941 had pushed German forces back from Moscow, shattering the myth of their invincibility. Now, as spring turned to summer, Hitler needed a new strategy. Germany was running out of oil. The mechanized Wehrmacht consumed fuel at a voracious rate. Tanks, trucks, aircraft, and ships all required petroleum products. Romania's Ploiești oil fields provided some relief, but it wasn't enough. The Reich needed more. And in the southern reaches of the Soviet Union lay the answer, the oil fields of the Caucasus, particularly around Baku in Azerbaijan, which produced over 70% of Soviet petroleum. If Germany could capture those fields, it would solve the fuel crisis and simultaneously cripple the Red Army's mobility. Thus was born Fall Blau, Case Blue, the summer offensive of 1942. The plan called for Army Group South to drive southeast from Ukraine, cross the Don River, and push deep into the Caucasus. The operation involved nearly 2 million men, thousands of tanks and aircraft, and represented Germany's last major offensive capability on the Eastern Front. Hitler was betting everything on this campaign. But there was a complication. As German forces drove south toward the oil fields, their northern flank would be dangerously exposed. Soviet forces could potentially strike from the east, cutting off the entire offensive. To prevent this, Hitler ordered that a city on the Volga River be neutralized, a city that bore the name of his greatest enemy. That city was Stalingrad. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, received his orders in July 1942. Advance to the Volga, capture or destroy Stalingrad, and secure the northern flank of the Caucasus offensive. Paulus was a meticulous, intelligent officer, a former deputy chief of the general staff known for his careful planning and attention to logistics. He commanded over 270,000 men, battle-hardened veterans of campaigns in France, the Balkans, and Russia. They were equipped with hundreds of Panzer III and IV tanks, self-propelled guns, and extensive artillery support. The Sixth Army was one of the finest formations in the Wehrmacht. Taking Stalingrad, Paulus believed, would be difficult but achievable. He had no idea he was marching into hell. The advance began in late July, and for the first few weeks everything went according to plan. German forces swept across the open steppe, brushing aside Soviet resistance. The weather was brutally hot, temperatures soaring above 40 degrees Celsius, and soldiers marched through clouds of choking dust, their water supplies constantly running low. But spirits remained high. The victories of 1941 had convinced most German soldiers that the Red Army was finished, that one more push would bring final victory. Soviet forces fell back, but they were not just running. Under orders from Stalin and the Soviet High Command, they were trading space for time, buying precious weeks to organize a proper defense. By early August, as German forces approached the Don River, Soviet resistance began to stiffen. Artillery fire became more coordinated, air attacks more frequent. The advance slowed from kilometers per day to meters per hour. On 23 August 1942, the Luftwaffe launched its assault on Stalingrad. Over 1,000 aircraft, Heinkel H-111 bombers, Junkers Ju-80s, and the infamous Stuka dive bombers filled the skies above the city. Wave after wave of aircraft dropped high explosive and incendiary bombs, turning neighborhoods into infernos. The wooden structures of the city's residential areas ignited instantly, creating firestorms that generated hurricane-force winds and consumed all available oxygen. Entire families suffocated in basements or were burned alive as they fled. The Volga itself became a river of fire as oil storage tanks along the riverbank exploded, spreading burning fuel across the water. German reconnaissance pilots, flying over the burning city, reported that nothing could have survived. Surely, they radioed back to headquarters, Soviet resistance would collapse. They were catastrophically wrong. The rubble and ruins would become the Red Army's greatest defensive asset, transforming Stalingrad into a fortress unlike any the Germans had ever encountered. By late August, German forces began entering the city's northern suburbs. What they found there defied all their expectations and training. The man responsible for defending Stalingrad was General Vasily Chuikov, a 42-year-old peasant's son who had risen through the ranks through sheer courage and tactical brilliance. Appointed commander of the 62nd Army in September, Chuikov arrived at a city that was already half destroyed and largely surrounded. Most commanders would have seen the situation as hopeless. Chuikov saw opportunity. He understood that in the ruins of an urban battlefield, German advantages in armor, artillery, and air power would largely evaporate. Tanks were vulnerable in rubble-choked streets. Artillery observers couldn't see through the smoke and dust. Luftwaffe pilots couldn't identify targets in the chaos of close-quarters combat. Chuikov articulated his strategy in brutally simple terms. We will hug the enemy so close that their own guns and bombs will kill them. This doctrine of hugging the enemy transformed Stalingrad into a nightmare. Soviet positions were established as close as possible to German lines, sometimes separated by a single wall, a staircase, a floor of a building. Firefights erupted at ranges of 5 to 10 meters. Soldiers threw grenades through holes in walls and floors. Snipers fired from rubble piles at Germans barely 20 meters away. The battle became intimate and savage, fought with submachine guns, bayonets, sharpened entrenching tools, and bare hands. Choikov established his headquarters on the eastern bank of the Volga, connected to his troops by radio and by perilous river crossings conducted every night under German fire. Boats and rafts ferried reinforcements, ammunition and supplies across the river, often under artillery bombardment and aerial attack. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed before they ever set foot in the city, drowning in the Volga or blown apart on the crossing. But the flow never stopped. Stalin had issued Order Number 227, not one step back, which decreed that any soldier who retreated without authorization would be executed. Blocking detachments with machine guns were positioned behind Soviet lines to enforce the order. The message was brutally clear: fight to the death or die as a coward. German infantry entered the city expecting to fight demoralized remnants. Instead, they encountered resistance that bordered on fanatical. Soviet soldiers fought from cellars, sewers, and ruins. They emerged from rubble piles to attack German positions, then vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Every building became a fortress, every street a killing ground. One German lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We have fought for 2 weeks to capture a single street. We took the first house after 3 days of fighting. We took the second house after 5 days. Yesterday we finally reached the end of the street. This morning when we woke, the Russians had reoccupied the first house. We must begin again. This is not war. This is slaughter. This is insanity." As September turned to October, the fighting concentrated around Stalingrad's industrial heart, 3 massive factory complexes that would become legendary: the Red October Steel Factory, the Barakati Gun Factory, and the Dzerzhinsky Tractor Factory. These were not ordinary factories. They were sprawling industrial landscapes covering hundreds of acres, filled with workshops, assembly halls, warehouses, railway sidings, and blast furnaces. The buildings were constructed of reinforced concrete and steel designed to withstand industrial accidents, making them incredibly resistant to artillery and bombing. The factories provided ideal defensive terrain. Soviet soldiers fought from behind overturned machinery, blast furnaces, and steel girders. They established firing positions in crane cabins 50 meters above the ground. They rigged booby traps in darkened corridors and collapsed sections. The Germans, trained for open-terrain maneuver warfare, found themselves fighting a grinding, attritional battle in conditions that nullified all their advantages. The Red October factory was particularly hellish. The foundries, damaged by bombing, continued to smolder, filling the air with toxic smoke and fumes. Soldiers fought in near-total darkness, illuminated only by muzzle flashes and the glow of fires. The ground was slick with oil, blood, and molten metal. Temperatures inside the factory fluctuated wildly, freezing cold in the open sections, unbearably hot near the furnaces. Corpses lay where they fell, often for days, as neither side could safely retrieve them. The stench was overwhelming. One particularly legendary episode of resistance occurred at a 4-story apartment building designated on Soviet maps as Dom Pavlov, Pavlov's house. In late September, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a small reconnaissance platoon occupied the building, which overlooked a key square in the city center. The building provided excellent observation over German positions and routes of advance. Pavlov's men, about 30 soldiers representing multiple Soviet ethnicities, Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, and Tajiks, transformed the apartment building into a miniature fortress. They fortified walls with sandbags and rubble, knocked holes through interior walls to create fields of fire, positioned anti-tank rifles and machine guns at windows, laid mines around the perimeter, and dug a communication trench connecting them to other Soviet positions. For 58 days, Pavlov's garrison held that building against constant German attacks. Infantry assaults, tank attacks, artillery bombardment, nothing could dislodge them. The Germans became obsessed with capturing it. One German general later claimed, with some exaggeration, that his forces suffered more casualties trying to capture Pavlov's house than they had suffered capturing all of Paris. Whether literally true or not, the statement captured the grinding, attritional nature of Stalingrad. Pavlov survived the battle and was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor in the Red Army. The building still stands today, preserved as a memorial to the defenders of Stalingrad. By early November, the Sixth Army had pushed the Soviets into a narrow strip of land along the Volga, in places no more than a few hundred meters wide. Chuikov's headquarters was under constant bombardment. Several times, German forces reached the riverbank, cutting off Soviet units, but the 62nd Army refused to break. Outnumbered, outgunned, and nearly surrounded, they held. The cost was staggering. Soviet casualties were catastrophic, thousands killed every day. Entire divisions were destroyed within 48 hours of arrival. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier in Stalingrad was estimated at 24 hours. Reinforcements crossed the Volga, knowing they were unlikely to survive the week. Yet they came anyway, wave after wave, driven by a combination of patriotism, coercion, and simple determination not to let their comrades down. German casualties were mounting just as rapidly. Battalions that had begun with 800 men were reduced to 100 or fewer. Replacements arrived constantly, but they were increasingly poorly trained, teenage conscripts and older reservists who had little preparation for the horror of Stalingrad. Officers were killed at an alarming rate, forcing inexperienced NCOs and junior officers to take command. Morale began to crack. Soldiers wrote letters home describing Stalingrad as a Rattenkrieg, a rat war, where survival was measured in hours, not days. Paulus launched one final offensive in mid-November, committing his last reserves in a desperate attempt to finish the battle before winter. For several days, it seemed the Soviets might finally break. German troops reached the Volga in multiple locations, fragmenting the 62nd Army into isolated pockets. But Chuikov ordered his men to hold, and hold they did. Then, on 19th November, as the sun rose over the frozen steppe northwest of Stalingrad, everything changed. While the Sixth Army had been bleeding itself white in the ruins of Stalingrad, Soviet High Command had been quietly planning the most ambitious counteroffensive of the war. General Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most brilliant strategist, and General Alexander Vasilevsky, chief of the General Staff, had spent months assembling forces north and south of the city. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers, 13,500 artillery pieces, 900 tanks, and 1,400 aircraft were moved into position with extraordinary secrecy. The Soviets had identified a fatal flaw in German dispositions. The long flanks of the Stalingrad salient were held not by German troops, but by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian forces. These Allied units were poorly equipped, poorly trained, stretched dangerously thin, and suffered from low morale. They lacked adequate anti-tank weapons, winter clothing, and reserves. Soviet intelligence had noted this vulnerability and designed Operation Uranus to exploit it. The plan called for a massive double envelopment. Soviet forces would smash through the weak Romanian positions north and south of Stalingrad, then drive toward each other to encircle the entire Sixth Army. If successful, it would be one of the largest encirclements in military history. On 19th November, when the sun rose over the frozen steppe northwest of Stalingrad, change came. The artillery barrage was unlike anything the Romanians had experienced. Over 3,500 guns pulverized their positions for 80 minutes. Then came the tanks, hundreds of T-34s and KV-1s supported by waves of infantry. The Romanian Third Army, already demoralized and freezing in inadequate winter clothing, collapsed within hours. Entire divisions disintegrated. Officers lost contact with their units. Survivors fled west in panic, abandoning weapons, equipment, and wounded comrades. The next day, 20th November, the southern pincers struck with equal ferocity. The Romanian Fourth Army south of Stalingrad suffered the same fate. Soviet forces punched through their lines and raced west, covering astonishing distances. The two Soviet spearheads, mobile tank and mechanized corps moving at speed across the steppe, drove toward each other like the jaws of a steel trap. On 23rd November, near the small town of Kalach on the Don River, approximately 60 kilometers west of Stalingrad, advance elements of the Soviet 4th Tank Corps and 4th Mechanized Corps linked up. The trap snapped shut. Over 290,000 German and Axis soldiers, the entire 6th Army, plus elements of the 4th Panzer Army, were encircled in a pocket roughly 50 kilometers wide and 40 kilometers deep. The news reached Paulus like a thunderbolt. His immediate reaction was correct. Request permission to break out immediately while Soviet forces were still organizing and the encirclement remained relatively weak. He radioed Hitler, explaining the situation and urgently requesting authorization to retreat westward and fight through the Soviet lines. Hitler's response sealed the fate of the 6th Army. The 6th Army will hold its positions. Surrender is forbidden. The army will hold until relieved by forces attacking from the outside. The order to hold was influenced by Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, who confidently assured Hitler that the Air Force could supply the encircled forces. Göring promised 300 tons of supplies per day, the minimum required to sustain the 6th Army. It was a reckless promise, based on wishful thinking, personal vanity, and complete ignorance of logistical realities. The Luftwaffe's attempt to supply Stalingrad was doomed from the start. The distances were too great, over 200 kilometers from the nearest German air bases to the pocket. The weather in late November and December was abysmal. Blizzards, fog, and freezing temperatures grounded flights for days at a time. The Luftwaffe lacked sufficient transport aircraft, and Soviet anti-aircraft defenses and fighter patrols were devastatingly effective. Lumbering Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft, slow and vulnerable, became easy prey for Soviet Yak-1 and Lag-3 fighters. German transport crews faced a gauntlet of flak and interceptors. Many never reached the pocket. Those that did found themselves landing on airfields under constant artillery bombardment, where unloading supplies became a frantic race against incoming shells. On the best days, the Luftwaffe delivered 100 tons of supplies. Most days it was far less, sometimes as little as 20 tons. By late December, the average was barely 60 tons per day, 1/5 of what was needed. The shortfall was catastrophic. Rations were cut, then cut again, then cut once more. By Christmas, German soldiers were surviving on 200 grams of bread per day, about one thin slice, and watery soup made from horse bones. When the horses were gone, soldiers scavenged the ruins for anything remotely edible. They boiled leather belts to extract any remaining nutrients. They caught rats and roasted them over fires. Some resorted to eating the glue from boot soles. Hunger became a constant, gnawing presence. Men became gaunt and hollow-eyed, their uniforms hanging loose on emaciated frames. Starvation weakened immune systems. Disease spread rapidly: typhus, dysentery, pneumonia. Thousands died not from enemy action, but from hunger and illness. The cold was equally merciless. Winter descended with savage intensity. Temperatures plummeted to -20, then -30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers had not been issued winter clothing. They still wore the same lightweight uniforms they had fought in during summer. They stuffed newspaper and straw into their tunics for insulation. They wrapped their feet in rags. It was never enough. Frostbite became epidemic. Soldiers lost fingers, toes, ears, and noses. Medics performed amputations with hacksaws and kitchen knives, often without anesthesia, as medical supplies had run out. The wounded lay in freezing cellars, untreated, slowly dying from infection and gangrene. The living envied the dead, who at least no longer suffered. One German officer wrote, "We are no longer soldiers. We are walking corpses. We shuffle through the snow, too weak to stand upright, too numb to feel anything. We have forgotten what warmth feels like, what a full stomach feels like. We know only cold and hunger and the certainty that we will die here, far from home, in this frozen wasteland." In mid-December, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, a desperate relief attempt. Manstein assembled Army Group Don from forces scraped together across the southern front. His spearhead, the 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth, drove northeast toward the pocket with approximately 230 tanks and 3 infantry divisions. The relief force made impressive initial progress, smashing through Soviet defensive lines and advancing rapidly. By 19th December, Hoth's panzers had reached a point just 48 kilometers from the pocket. For a brief, shining moment, rescue seemed possible. German tankers could see the glow of artillery fire on the horizon, the besieged city they were fighting to reach. Manstein radioed Paulus, urging him to launch a breakout operation, codenamed Operation Thunderclap, to link up with the relief force. But Paulus hesitated. His forces were weak, desperately low on fuel, and scattered across the pocket in defensive positions. Breaking out would require abandoning heavy equipment and concentrating forces for an offensive operation, a risky maneuver. More critically, Hitler had explicitly forbidden any attempt to abandon Stalingrad. Paulus, a loyal and obedient officer, refused to act without authorization from the Führer. Hitler, in turn, refused to grant that authorization. He insisted the 6th Army remain in Stalingrad and wait for Manstein to break through to them. The opportunity slipped away. Soviet forces counterattacked Manstein's flanks with ferocity, forcing the relief operation to halt. By 23rd December, Hoth was fighting just to maintain his own positions. On Christmas Eve, facing encirclement himself, Manstein ordered a withdrawal. Operation Winter Storm had failed. The 6th Army was abandoned to its fate. The psychological impact on the encircled soldiers was devastating. Many had clung to the hope of rescue, believing their comrades would reach them. When the relief attempt collapsed, that hope died. Despair spread through the pocket like a disease. January 1943 brought no mercy. The Soviet noose tightened day by day. The Luftwaffe's supply effort had effectively ceased. Soviet anti-aircraft fire was so intense the German pilots refused to land, instead dropping supplies from altitude. Most cargo was destroyed on impact or drifted into Soviet lines. On 8th January, the Soviets offered terms of surrender. A delegation approached German lines under a white flag, carrying an ultimatum. Surrender now and all prisoners would receive humane treatment, medical care, adequate food, and eventual repatriation after the war. The offer was genuine. Stalin wanted to end the battle and redeploy his forces for further offensives. Paulus consulted Hitler by radio. The Führer's response was immediate and uncompromising. Surrender is forbidden. The Sixth Army will fight to the last man and the last bullet. Paulus declined the Soviet offer. The siege would continue. The final Soviet assault began on January 10th. Over 7,000 artillery pieces, the largest concentration of firepower ever assembled on the Eastern Front, opened fire on the western edge of the pocket. The bombardment was apocalyptic, obliterating what remained of German defenses. Then came the infantry and armor, wave after wave, overwhelming the starving, frozen defenders. German resistance was fierce in places. Isolated units fought with desperate courage, knowing they were doomed, but determined to sell their lives dearly. But ammunition was exhausted, weapons malfunctioned in the cold, and men were too weak to fight effectively. Units simply collapsed. Thousands surrendered, thousands more died where they stood. By 26 January, the pocket had been split into two, a northern and southern Kessel, or cauldron, with no contact between them. The northern pocket, centered on the tractor factory, held out for a few more days before surrendering on 2 February. The southern pocket, where Paulus had his headquarters, was compressed into a few square kilometers around the city center. On 30th January, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, the Führer sent Paulus a final message, promoting him to field marshal. It was a cynical, calculated gesture. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive. The expectation was that they would fight to the death or commit suicide rather than face the dishonor of surrender. Hitler was sending a clear message: die with honor, or take your own life. Paulus chose neither. On 31st January 1943, Soviet troops stormed the Uniform department store on Red Square, where Paulus had established his final command post in the basement. They found the newly promoted field marshal sitting at a table, exhausted and hollow-eyed, but alive. A Soviet officer entered the room and asked, "Are you Field Marshal Paulus?" The German commander nodded slowly. "Then I accept your surrender." Paulus surrendered, becoming the first German field marshal ever to be captured alive. His staff officers and remaining soldiers laid down their weapons. Across the southern pocket, resistance collapsed. By the end of the day, over 91,000 German soldiers had been taken prisoner. The northern pocket held out one more day, then surrendered on 2 February. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The statistics are almost incomprehensible. Of the 290,000 Axis soldiers encircled in November, approximately 100,000 had been killed or died of starvation, disease, and cold during the siege. Another 91,000 were captured. Of those prisoners, fewer than 6,000 would ever return home. The rest died in Soviet POW camps from malnutrition, overwork, disease, and mistreatment over the next several years. Soviet losses were staggering in absolute numbers, over 1.1 million casualties, including approximately 40,000 civilians killed in the initial bombing and subsequent fighting. The human cost was beyond calculation. But unlike Germany, the Soviet Union had vast reserves of manpower. The losses could be replaced. Germany's could not. The impact of Stalingrad reverberated across the world. For the first time, an entire German field army, one of the most powerful and experienced formations in the Wehrmacht, had been annihilated. The myth of German invincibility, carefully nurtured by years of spectacular victories, shattered like glass. In Germany, Joseph Goebbels declared 3 days of national mourning. Radio broadcasts played somber music. Theaters and cinemas closed. The propaganda minister attempted to portray the Sixth Army's destruction as a heroic sacrifice, a modern-day Thermopylae. But the German people were not fooled. They had been promised swift victory, total triumph. Instead, their sons and brothers were dying by the hundreds of thousands in a frozen Russian city most had never heard of. Morale plummeted. Doubt crept into the national consciousness. For the first time, Germans began to whisper a previously unthinkable question: what if we lose? For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became the defining moment of the Great Patriotic War. The city was awarded the title Hero City, one of the highest honors in the Soviet system. Monuments were erected, memorials built, parades held. The story of Stalingrad became central to Soviet identity, a narrative of resilience, sacrifice, and ultimate triumph against overwhelming odds. Stalin, who had micromanaged the war effort and made catastrophic errors in 1941, emerged from Stalingrad with enhanced prestige and authority. The victory vindicated his decision to stand and fight, even though that decision had cost over 1 million Soviet lives. Strategically, Stalingrad marked the irreversible turning point on the Eastern Front. After February 1943, the Wehrmacht was permanently on the defensive in the East. The Red Army, now growing in strength, experience, and equipment, would launch offensive after offensive, driving relentlessly westward toward Germany. The road from Stalingrad led, ultimately and inevitably, to Berlin. For the soldiers who survived, Stalingrad remained a wound that never healed. German veterans spoke of it in hushed tones, if they spoke of it at all. It was a trauma too deep for words, a descent into a frozen hell from which they had emerged physically, but never mentally. Soviet veterans remembered it as the hardest test of their lives, a crucible that had tested them to the limits of human endurance. Many carried physical scars, missing limbs, frostbite damage, shrapnel wounds. All carried psychological scars that would last a lifetime. One Soviet nurse who had treated wounded soldiers throughout the 5-month battle walked through the ruins in early February after the German surrender. She later wrote, "I walked through streets I no longer recognized. Every building was destroyed. There were no trees, no birds, no living things, just silence, snow, and the bodies of the dead. We had won," they told us. "We had saved the city, saved the motherland. But looking around at the destruction, I wondered what we had truly saved. Only ruins remained. Only ghosts remained." The Battle of Stalingrad stands as the bloodiest battle in human history. Over 2 million soldiers and civilians were killed, wounded, or captured. An ancient city was obliterated, reduced to rubble and ash. And the course of the Second World War, perhaps the entire 20th century, was irrevocably altered. Stalingrad proved that the Wehrmacht was not invincible, that Nazi Germany could be defeated. It demonstrated the extraordinary resilience of the Soviet people and the Red Army. It showed that courage, determination, and sacrifice could triumph over technological superiority and tactical brilliance. And it revealed the terrible cost of hubris, the catastrophic consequences when dictators prioritize symbolism over strategy, when pride overrules reason, when the lives of soldiers are spent in pursuit of vanity. The frozen ruins of Stalingrad became a graveyard for Hitler's ambitions in the East. From those ruins, the Red Army rose, bloodied, exhausted, but unbroken and unbowed. The soldiers who survived that memory of the battle across Eastern Europe, through Poland and Germany, all the way to the ruins of Berlin in May 1945. Stalingrad was not just a battle, It was a turning point, a reckoning, a moment when the arc of history bent toward justice and liberation. It was humanity at its worst, the savage brutality of industrial warfare, and humanity at its best, ordinary people displaying extraordinary courage in defense of their homeland. The lesson of Stalingrad is written in blood and snow. Tyranny can be defeated, but the cost of victory is measured in the lives of those who fight for it, and that cost must never be forgotten. But while Stalingrad marked the beginning of Germany's long retreat in the east, another desperate struggle was unfolding in the frozen forests of northwestern Europe, a battle that would test Allied courage and determination like never before. Join us next time as we uncover the story of the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last gamble to change the course of the war.